So, let's talk about the Vietnam War. At its heart, it was one nation's desperate struggle for its own independence. But that fight got tangled up in something much, much bigger, the massive ideological battle we call the Cold War.
And that's really the big question here, isn't it? How on earth did a war for national freedom get turned into a battleground for global superpowers? Well, let's dive in. You see, at its very core, this was supposed to be a war for a single, unified, and independent Vietnam. And this was a dream, really, championed by one man, Ho Chi Minh. But to really get how that dream became a total nightmare, we've got to go way back.
The roots of this war go way deeper than the 1950s. We're talking almost 100 years earlier, to a time of colonialism that had Vietnam fighting for its very soul long before a single American soldier ever stepped foot there.
Okay, so this timeline really lays it all out. For decades, starting way back in 1857, Vietnam was a French colony. Then, in 1941, Ho Chi Minh creates the Viet Minh, basically a league for Vietnam's independence to finally get their freedom. But things got even more complicated when Japan invaded during World War II. And after Japan surrendered in 1945, the Allies just cut the country in two, which led straight into the First Indochina War, with the Vietnamese fighting to kick the French out once and for all.
So, after all that fighting against the French, you'd think Vietnam would finally be united, right? Nope. When the war ended in 1954, the country was officially split in half, creating a total powder keg with a fuse that was already burning.
Okay, so here's what happened. The 1954 Geneva Accords basically sliced Vietnam in two, right at the 17th parallel. In the north, you've got Ho Chi Minh and his communist government in Hanoi, with the Soviet Union and China in his corner. And in the south, you've got Ngo Dinh Diem's anti-communist government down in Saigon, backed by the United States. The whole idea was to have an election in 2 years to bring the country back together. Spoiler alert, that election never happened.
So you might be asking, why was the US so deeply involved in a country halfway across the world? Well, it all came down to this one big fear, something called the domino theory. The thinking was, if Vietnam falls to communism, all its neighbors would just topple over, one after the other, just like dominoes. So for the US, holding the line in Vietnam wasn't just about Vietnam, it was about stopping the spread of global communism.
So, America starts by sending money, then some military advisors, but that was just the beginning. It took one really controversial event to drag the US headfirst into a full-blown war.
And this was the spark. August 1964, there's this supposed attack, and I'm stressing alleged, on U.S. warships in the Gulf of Tonkin. This was all the justification the government needed. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and boom, the door to send in combat troops was thrown wide open. Now here's the kicker. It later came out that the whole incident was, well, questionable at best. Many believe it was just a pretext for war.
And just look at what happened next. Within a few short years, by 1967, there were almost 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. 500,000! The buildup was just staggering.
And this really shows you the vicious cycle of the war. The US would unleash these huge bombing campaigns like Operation Rolling Thunder. But the Vietnamese would just counter with incredible guerrilla tactics and these massive complex tunnel systems. So the US would escalate again, using terrible chemical weapons like napalm and Agent Orange to destroy the jungle. But in the end, all the American firepower was no match for local knowledge and sheer determination.
So back home in the States, the government's painting this rosy picture, right? They're saying, we're winning, victory is right around the corner. But then 1968 happened, and one single event just blew that whole story to pieces.
That event was the Tet Offensive. Now, militarily, this huge surprise attack was actually a failure for North Vietnam. But, and this is a huge but, psychologically, it was a knockout blow. It proved to everyone, especially the American public watching on their TVs, that the enemy was nowhere near defeated. The war was far, far from over. And it wasn't just the fighting. Suddenly, these awful stories started coming out. The kind of stuff that makes your stomach turn. Things like the My Lai massacre, where American soldiers murdered hundreds of unarmed civilians. Women, children, old men. The horrifying truth of the war was finally coming to light.
But the real nail in the coffin for public support? The Pentagon Papers. This was a top-secret government report that got leaked, and it basically confirmed everyone's worst fears. The government had been systematically lying. For years. The war wasn't ending, it wasn't even close. And the reaction to all this was just explosive. You had massive anti-war protests erupting everywhere, people completely lost faith in the government, and the pressure to just get out of Vietnam became enormous. It was so huge, in fact, that it got Richard Nixon elected president in 1969, all because he promised one thing: I will end this war.
So, there you have it. Public support is gone, nobody trusts the government, and the final chapter of America's war in Vietnam starts to unfold. And it's not a story of victory, it's a story of retreat. Nixon's plan was called Vietnamization. The idea was pretty simple: pull American troops out and let the South Vietnamese army take over the fighting. And by 1973, with the Paris Peace Accords, it was official. America's direct involvement in the war was over. But the war itself? Oh, it was far from over. Just 2 years later, April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks came rolling right into Saigon. The South just collapsed. And after decades of bloodshed, Vietnam was finally one country again. Under the communist rule Ho Chi Minh had wanted all along.
And the price of this war was just devastating. For the United States, it meant more than 58,000 military personnel never came home. But as high as that number is, it's just a fraction of what Vietnam lost. We're talking an estimated 1.2 million Vietnamese people, soldiers and civilians, killed, homes destroyed, families shattered, an entire nation scarred forever.
Which leaves you with a really heavy question to think about, right? What is the true cost? What's the real price we pay when one country's fight for its own freedom becomes the chessboard for a superpower's global game?